My name is David Watson. I'm from Detroit, born in Detroit. I live in a sort of working class suburb of Detroit now, just off over the the notorious 8 Mile line. So Warren, Michigan, where I grew up, was a soulless, banal place. No one read books of any substance or talked about anything except cars and sports. They drank a lot or went to church or both. Racism was they drank a lot too. Racism was so deeply rooted and pervasive that no one even talked about it. But for me, it was incredibly alienating, and the 60s were going on. And I hated the place, so that's how I ended up going to Detroit, where suddenly my friends were all black guys from the West Side and Jewish kids and Latinos, and it really changed my life. The anti-war movement was critical to my formation, the anti-Vietnam War movement, and from that, I would eventually become part of the New Left and the counterculture in Detroit. So I turned against the war very young. I put out an underground paper in my junior high in the 9th grade. The middle school used to be 7 through 9. And I started going downtown to downtown Detroit to go look around the Wayne State University campus. Wayne State was sort of now north of downtown Detroit, in this kind of, the neighborhoods around it were kind of bohemian. There were a lot of leftists around there and hippies and so on. So in like 1966, I was going down there and going into bookstores and buying books. The communist bookstore I was finding. I found the anti-war movement. I started volunteering for the anti-war movement. I was the founding chairman of the Detroit High School Committee to End the War in Vietnam in 1967. In 1967, of course, the city burned. The famous Detroit Rebellion or riot occurred in the summer of 1967, when I was starting to get involved in activism in the city. And in the fall of 1967, I was convinced my parents to go leave Warren schools. I was actually East Detroit's public schools, another city called East Detroit, which was also very racist. I hated where I was living, and I wanted to get away from them, and I wanted to go to a school in the city, and I paid tuition to go to the magnet school in Detroit called Cass Tech High. And so in the fall of 1967, after the city burned, my best friend and I, who went down there for the music, it had a storied music program. I went down there we both went out down there to get away from Warren. We started high school. So that started a whole odyssey in my political development. I soon became, in high school, I became a Marxist. I was a Trotskyist. I got recruited from other people, young people in the committee to end the war, the high school committee, to the Young Socialist Alliance. And I was a big recruiter for the Socialist Alliance. I was in that for about a year and a half. And, from then, after I left the YSA because I felt really young and I wanted to learn about other forms of left-wing politics. I wanted to read philosophy. I felt uncomfortable. I was very grateful, and I'm still grateful for the amount of reading I did: Marx, Lenin, Trotsky, history, C.L.R. James, people like that, other Wilfred Burchett and other people, Malcolm X. This was all a really great education for me. But I left them and I got into the New Left. I was more involved in the New Left and began smoking weed and becoming a kind of a hippie, radical. And I dropped out of high school. I figured we didn't need high schools. If Che Guevara could say that he used to be a doctor when people asked him how they could live in our society. Now he was a revolutionary, even though he practiced medicine as a revolutionary. I figured I didn't need to be a student. I could just be a revolutionary. So I was around the independent left in Detroit after that, and I eventually found a way. I worked in the factory for a while. I found a way somebody said I could get grants and go to college. And so I ended up going to Wayne State University. I studied at Wayne State University and got a degree basically in revolution. We were organizing classes on my Marxism and stuff. We were getting away with murder. No student could get away probably with what we got away with now in terms of getting professors to organize classes with us. I guess it happened somewhere, but we were on the fringe for sure. I hadn't even thought about anarchism until the mid 70s. I was also started hanging around with people who had been around the left or around like these kind of bohemian milieu. In Detroit, interestingly, Detroit has an anti-authoritarian background in history of organic history, in a sense, of anti-authoritarian Marxists, for example, the News and Letters organization with Raya Dunayevskaya, all these ex-Trotskyists had been there. They had left Leninism, Trotskyism for a more open-ended Marxist, more libertarian Marxist position. The group Facing Reality, C.L.R. James was one of the people in that. A lot of these people were around Detroit. You would rub shoulders with some of them. I knew Marty Glaberman, who was one of these people in that milieu when I was young, going to Cass and a little bit. And so that was in the air. There were a lot of course, it was also a place where there was this sort of countercultural radicalism. And there was like the artist workshop in Detroit, famous where the MC5 came out of, and people like that, John Sinclair. So it was a lot of this sort of ferment, this countercultural, viscerally anti-authoritarian milieu. There was also a very unique group of Black revolutionaries in Detroit called the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. I knew some of those people. I was young. I was hanging around with one of the younger guys in that group, and so they were an independent Marxist group that not associated with one of these small party sects. Trying to sort things out. They were very pragmatic in a sense, experimental in what they were trying to do. They were a very significant movement in Detroit. So that was all happening. When I went to Wayne, I was able to continue reading. I wanted to go into Russian studies. I was still really worked up about Russian history, revolutionary Russian history. A lot of other things were interesting to me too. I started, as early as 1969, I started writing off and on for a paper called The Fifth Estate, which was one of the original underground papers in the United States. It started in 1965, and a lot of really radical stuff, workerist stuff, Black revolutionary stuff, radical countercultural stuff, the White Panther Party, Liberation News Service, all this stuff was coming through the paper, and I was hanging around off and on there and writing even when I was in high school, and when I had become a high school dropout for a while, I was writing for that. So I ended up connecting also with other people who were around 1974, 75. It was clear that the left, the organized left, the SDS had broken up earlier. And the organized left, what remained of the organized left were these narrow sects, these party sects who had nationally a few hundred members. Nobody was listening to them. The whole zeitgeist was changing in the country. The students were no longer worried about going to war because the draft had ended. The United States had pulled out its ground troops. Detroit had really gone into an industrial decline that started really back in the 1950s when my parents were moving to Warren. I mean, the factories they built in Warren, for example, were part of a trend of the auto industries to really to globalize their businesses. This was early phases of globalization, and to pull them out of the city. And so Detroit became kind of a sacrifice zone. Its tax base basically collapsed. Then there was the auto industry went into a tailspin in the mid 70s. There was the Arab oil boycott that happened in the 70s and so on. The riot, the city had never really recovered from the riot. Thousands of buildings and homes were burned in that. And so Detroit went from being this exciting revolutionary black Petrograd of revolution that people from Europe would come and visit, to study, to look at. It turned into a lumpen proletarian wasteland. And that was sort of the basis of my political consciousness and so on. We were proud in the sense of the entropy and the toughness and the rawness of Detroit. It wasn't just happening in Detroit. It was happening throughout many places in the so-called Rust Belt and so on along the East Coast. But Detroit became an icon of it because of the decline of the auto industry and the dispersion of the auto industry. This city the size of LA, with a population that eventually sank from about 2 million, I believe, to 700,000. I think it's dipped below 700,000. Maybe I'm getting to the weeds a little bit here, but this what happened in the mid 70s in Detroit was the Fifth Estate became an openly anti-authoritarian paper. Some friends of mine, we had been doing a lot of sort of like cultural terrorism around Wayne and in the city, against politicians, against corporations like the phone company. They had published a whole text on how to rip off the phone company, technically to rip them off, and actually were put on trial for it. And the trial did not end well for the company. They one time published an ad that was supposedly from GM saying, "Please do not kidnap these men." This was during a time when people were getting kidnapped in Italy and in Quebec, for example, by leftists and nationalists and so on. They put out an ad in the paper saying, "Do not kidnap these men," supposedly from GM, and giving their addresses, because somebody in the collective had actually worked at GM and gotten the addresses. And so that they were called terrorists. And I was on the fringe of it because my friends were really more openly anti-authoritarian. They were influenced by ultra-left communism and the situationists, less by anarchism per se. Although we all came to know an anarchist exile named Federico Arcos, who became very close to me. I became close to him, and my wife and I, who later I ended up studying Spanish. I'm jumping around in the chronology. Sorry, it's a complicated chronology. But anyway, Federico, the Spanish connection to Federico was big. And the Spanish Revolution really started sparking our imagination. And we started meeting anarchists, too. There were all these old anarchists in Detroit. It once had a thriving Italian, largely Italian, but also Spaniards and a Bulgarian we knew. These anarchists in Detroit, they'd had their own hall and everything. That was true in a lot of places, in fact. But so I was like a Marxist-Leninist of sorts, although I become like an independent. I defended Leninism against anarchism early on, but I was more interested in kind of ultra-left council communism. I was reading avidly a lot of revolutionary literature. Rosa Luxemburg. I was interested in other styles of rather than Leninism, because Leninism was looking like a complete debacle, and for reasons that it had brought upon itself, Leninism and Trotskyism, and they didn't see any point to follow those models. So we were all looking around. We were trying to talk about what it was like to be radical or revolutionary at a time when the radical movements were dissipating. The 60s was done with a vengeance, and many people were embracing capitalism. Detroit was it was basically a ruin in many ways. People were surviving, but it was a very tough place to be. And so we wanted to think about that. So we ended up writing a lot about this kind of decline and about looking into deeper reasons that went back, say, before even capitalism. What was the human problem? I should talk a little bit about how the Fifth Estate developed, because a big part of my radical activity was connected to the Fifth Estate. In the late 70s, we were actually the mid 70s. We got involved in the anti-nuclear war movement and the anti-nuclear movement, nuclear power movement, and some of it growing out of our anti-war, anti-militarism positions, and others starting to think about technology. I wrote an article called on the industrial plague, which I think I also mentioned. And so after that, we became well known as for our criticism on technology. We began to critique. We had started really with nuclear weapons and nuclear power, talking about how that is a social system, which we just called nuclearism, which demanded surveillance, which demanded a powerful state, which demanded an incredibly opaque system, social system and technological system, in which the left hand often was not aware of the right hand. A lot of irrational faith in the technology to never fail with enormous consequences, for containers of any kind not to leak, which containers are known to do from the beginning of time, to break or to leak. And we became basically Luddites. But I would say that we became Luddites in the sense of what Langdon Winner, who wrote Autonomous Technology, Techniques Out of Control as a Theme in Political Thought, called an epistemological Luddism, a kind of a taking things apart as an inquiry, a kind of school of inquiry, which appealed to me because it reminded me of the Greeks, the way the ancient Greeks were trying to talk about a school philosophy, which wasn't a religion. It was you didn't have to follow the precepts. You were supposed to critique and question the precepts and engage with your teacher and with your tradition as a part of the tradition. So that, the idea of deconstruction of technology as a social practice, questioning what technologies we need, how they influence our behavior, our social behavior, how they shape things, became an important thing, which led to ideas like, as they also came along in radical and ecological and philosophical milieu, deceleration, for example, which is the name of a great little activist magazine out in Texas that I support and have written for a little, and degrowth, which was also very interesting to us before anybody used the term around us. Anyway, when I finished college, I had, at the very end of college, I'd given up on Russian studies and I'd fallen in love with Spanish, and I left for Mexico. I wanted to never come back. That was my plan. I was going to be Arthur Rimbaud and go disappear, or be Traven and go disappear into the jungle. And I spent a little under a year in Mexico and Guatemala, traveling around to places I had read about. And but I had met my wife just before that, and there was a very big attraction, and I ended up coming back to Detroit. And so I came back to Detroit, and I drove a truck for a few years in a company that had been a collective. So they were all these drunken ex-Marxists themselves and radicals and kind of anarchists there. I did that for a while, and then I decided I would lose my Spanish if I didn't do something. My wife talked me into going to college again, and I quit that, and I went to graduate school and became got a master's in Spanish. After which we went to Spain, and we were in Spain and Portugal, a little bit in France. That was in 1983, where we met with lots of people over there who were in the ultra left and anarchists and so on. People that whose names and contacts Federico, the Spanish anarchist, uncle to us, gave us. You got to look up so and so. You got to look up so and so. We met a lot of people through him, and also other people who had been exchanging their radical anarcho-communist papers and anarchist papers with the Fifth Estate after it had become in 1975 an openly anti-authoritarian paper. I don't know. It was something about my experiences in Mexico. It was something about letting things sit for a while and being alone and thinking about stuff and keeping an open mind to possibilities. That when I came back, I was kind of an anarchist. I never really used the term anarchist too much. I was interested in any radical movement that was able to, create real communities, create real equality among people, respected diversity, that was flexible in its practice, that practiced mutual aid, all of these values associated with anarchism, but with tribal societies and peasant societies going back into prehistory and in other kinds of social formations. I was looking for answers to making revolution. So making a revolution that wasn't necessarily even a violent revolution. I was more inclined to nonviolence. I always said I believe nonviolence was a principle, but it wasn't a dogma. It was probably the first choice in any beginning toward trying to make social change. Another big place where at that time in the 80s, mid-late 80s, where that contributed to my evolution was the construction of the largest trash incinerator in the world, the Detroit incinerator, which a struggle which we lost. Eventually it was shut down in about the time frame we had predicted it would, about 30 years, but we were not able to defeat it. But I learned a lot from that process. And I've written about it, in fact, in that Deceleration magazine. People can look it up, David Watson, Deceleration, Detroit Incinerator, and they'll find an article with pictures about that movement, which was important because, when the social, what was it called? The social, the worldwide green sort of radical environmental movement, Social Forum came to Detroit in 2010. Local people in Detroit who had a new organization to fight the incinerator literally did not know that we had existed in the late 80s, early 90s, which was very common. It's actually a common, or was a common phenomenon that's talked about in the book Contaminated Communities, for example, a book that was very helpful to me, showing that people would fight horrible environmental toxic sites and then lose, and then the next generation would come along, wouldn't know about the first generation. But we had been doing a lot of things to fight the struggle, fight that struggle against the incinerator. There were years of big street protests, some of the biggest in a long time in Detroit, sit-ins, including in the governor's office, blockades of the incinerator with dozens of arrests, trials, which we generally won them all, and hearings and lawsuits, things that we as kind of anarchists, ultra-left anti-authoritarians, we had never really gone to hearings and things like that. But we were working with people who were doing a lot of that important work, the lawsuits and so on, collected a lot of information and so on. And we were a major part in the street action and a lot of the organizing, but there were other people doing a lot of other work, and I came to respect them a lot. And the other thing I came to realize that the city of Detroit, which was our adversary, it was hard to fight them. Because they were building this thing behind people's backs, and we found out very late in the process. And then it was very near our beloved Cass Corridor, which was this bohemian neighborhood south of Wayne State University. So it had a university population. It was very mixed ethnically, with students from the university, also Black people, and actually Native Americans and other people in that neighborhood. With a lot of radicals living around the neighborhood. The Fifth Estate office was in that neighborhood as well. To the east of us was what they called the Cultural Center, where the Detroit Institute of Arts is, and the main public library, and so on. And then to the east of that, in very close by, in one of the poorest voting districts in the United States, was where they were building this. I can't even remember how many thousands of tons per day incinerator that was going to spew out. Not only it was going to be horrible for the neighborhood. I was like 3/4 of a mile away, and sometimes the smell of the standing trash would literally wake me up and throw me out of my bed in the middle of the night with disgust. So it was ruining our neighborhood. It was ruining the neighborhood typically for poor people. It was ruining a cultural gem in the city. And it was representing everything that we were talking about, a society, as one of our allies said, that was living like there was no tomorrow and making it come true. So this also became part of our idea. It contributed to our understanding of technology, but it also made me rethink what I was learning from practice about how to create movements in a society, and how to work with people who didn't come to this movement with a very radical critique like our own. We wanted to stop the incinerator, and we didn't just want to prove a point about industrialism. We wanted a victory for people, because at that time, 1986, 87, we were already supporting also this burgeoning environmental movement. For example, out west, that was when Earth First started getting going, and we were making contacts with them. There were all these anarchist-inflected groups out there, trying to save the redwoods, trying to stop the mass destruction of areas, natural areas. Also, the defense of there was much going on in the defending places like Big Mountain in the Southwest, where people were fighting to protect native lands, sacred native lands. So we were trying to work with anybody we could. We were not interested in I'll just blow it all up kind of an attitude about the thing, even though even among us, there were a couple of friends that said they'd rather have including about nuclear power and about nuclear weapons and about the incinerator and so on. They preferred a movement that focused on daily life and the way that people reproduce capital in their daily life. But it seemed to us that we were all reproducing capital as we were resisting it, which was the big Zen koan, the big paradoxical reality that we were forced to face. So I also learned at the time that what was interesting is that the city of Detroit, they were more threatened by Clark Kenty, David Watson, who was fighting the incinerator and speaking at the hearings and so on and organizing protests, than they were about George Bradford, or my many pseudonyms I wrote under in the Fifth Estate, who was calling for the breaking civilization down and overthrowing capital and so on. And that was a meaningful moment for me. I worked on the Fifth Estate as I grew older. When I came back from Mexico, I worked on the Fifth Estate. After I went to Spain, I came back and was then again involved in the Fifth Estate. And around that time, I needed to either get a job in a factory, which I couldn't bring myself to do, or I had to get a job teaching or something. And I did not want to go be a PhD. So what did I end up doing? I ended up becoming a teacher. And coming back from Spain, I ended up getting hired by a private high school, which was amazing because it was generally a wealthy school, although it was a progressive school with a lot of people on scholarships, and including an inner city program that brought kids from the city into the school. So it was a mixed bag. But it was amazing that I was there, and I kept quiet for about a year, and then I started doing radical stuff out there. So that was in summer of 1984. I got that job, and I still am kind of connected to that because I ended up I retired from the classroom in 2018. So I was 34 years in the classroom. And I was the resident radical, and then pretty soon I was just openly radical. And the place was pretty progressive. So I was the only guy in the history of this school who ever took time off from work to get arrested in a blockade. I was able to live like that as sort of the resident radical, and I was able to teach. I taught Spanish. 9 years I taught English, where I had a chance to teach a lot of radical. In both places, I had a chance to bring in radical themes and themes that got kids questioning. And then I also, crazily, they asked me to run the newspaper because I had experience working on a newspaper. And I think I stopped working on the newspaper in about regularly in any sense in about 2010, something like that. It was getting less and less. My wife and I adopted a child when we were in our late 40s, a young child, and my job was demanding. And since then, I've been involved sporadically in activist stuff. I go back in Spain regularly and meet with radicals there. I talk to a lot of people. I published a couple books in Spain on technology, on radical politics. And I have many, many dear friends there, younger people and people my age and up. I mean, that's good enough. There's so many things that have gone on and that go on in a life. I mean, I've looked at a few of the interviews, and there are all these old guys with beards like me, mostly guys. We'll get some women in there. I saw 3. I'm going to listen to everybody in the end. I thought we should have like a little group and meet sometime, all of us. There are people I disagreed with strongly who I'd probably get along with just fine, at least learn to live and let live about it at our age. It wouldn't be like the John Sayles short story, which you may not have read, called The Anarchist Convention, which I recommend. It's about old anarchists having a convention. And of course, they're all fighting about what happened back in the 1930s. And who did what to whom, and who sold out the ideal, and so on. It has a great ending. It's a funny story. Anyway, I recommend it. Since this is a series of interviews focusing on anarchism, I'll talk a little bit about that. People ask, I've used, for the sake of a shorthand, I'm talking to anarchists. I've been involved in a lot of anarchist activities, but I've been in other kinds of activities too, with people who are sharing activities with people who are not anarchists. The Central America movement to support, keep the U.S. out of Central America. The Iraq wars, lots of protesting, and Black Lives Matter and civil rights and just the ecology. And my position has been experimental, tried to be open-minded about what to do to actually get things done. We never had like an intentional communitarian community in Detroit, where, or not since really the 60s or 70s, early 70s maybe, in which people, consciously lived together and created a commune of sorts in which they would work out a whole series of political issues. So people ask me, are you an anarchist? My students, for example, would ask me all the time, because they would see the Fifth Estate. I would put it in the school library. It was filled with anarchism. And they knew I was getting arrested. But when people ask me, are you an anarchist? My answer generally is, I am an anarchist unless you are. Or rather, I'm an anarcho-anarchist, because anarchism is just an argument. It's like saying you're a Christian or a communist. There's so many sects, there's so many kinds, and really, what does the person think anarchism is who's asking you the question? There used to be a cartoon way back in the day. It says how people think of anarchists. It was this little cartoon from Freedom magazine, I think, in famous magazine in Britain, and it showed the guy with like a kind of a witch's type hat and a black cape, and he was holding a fuse bomb he was going to throw at the king. And then I said, what anarchists are like in reality? And there was like a guy, presumably a husband and a wife. He's wearing a sports coat. She's wearing like a normal dress or something. And two little kids, goofy looking little kids. This is what anarchists really look like. Right. So, I mean, what appealed to me about anarchism was that this argument was often around a riddle. How do you live your life? How to be just, how to defend your own autonomy as an individual without being an asshole or a bully or a misanthrope, and actually learn to live in a society with other people. I liked the anti-authoritarianism of it, and I spent my career trying to navigate my power relation, which was inevitable if I didn't want to become chum. It was inevitable in a classroom to try to steer the discourse. Well, we're going to not go into that. We're going to do this. Like, we're learning the AR, ER, and IR verbs or something, we have to do that. I have to do it or I lose my job. You have to do it or you're going to fail. And the next person who comes in after me is going to be worse. I'm sorry. So that was that. And then there was the control of the class. And then also, for example, in an English class, there was the discourse. Like, anything goes doesn't work in most cases. And that's not what anarchists believe, mostly anything, that anything goes. Anarchists believe in responsibility. Anarchists classically have said anarchy is not chaos, it is order. Although if you study ancient Asian philosophies, there's a different definition of chaos as well, which the Tao, which is a kind of an order before we decided to call it order and started to disorder it. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's Taoism 101. And Taoism has always played a big role in my notion of what real anarchy might mean, real freedom, and real cooperation might mean. We also used to say constantly in the Fifth Estate that all isms are wasms, and that's sort of. I grew up, my father was liked to read, was an engineer. He ended up becoming an engineer. He worked his way up, and was a science, math genius of some kind. Which I did not inherit from him, but he admired Alfred Korzybski, the general semanticist, and he used to always say that the thing is not the label, the label is not the thing, and to me that was also an important lesson to me about not believing everything my mind tells me. And paying attention, for one thing, a thing is more than a thing. And a label is much more than a label. And, we used to say also around the Fifth Estate, if you have a theory, you own your ideas. Your ideas, you serve you. If you have an ideology, you are owned by your ideas. And I don't know if that will resonate with many people, but it's again an idea. It's again it's not even a perfect saying, because the notion that you own your ideas or don't own your ideas also brings up problems of its own. But I've tried to be flexible. In fact, in the book I wrote, it was a collection of my writings from the Fifth Estate and a couple other places that I wrote in the late 90s, collected it in the late 90s, against the mega machine, Essays on Empire and Its Enemies. I quoted Gandhi in the beginning of it, who said, "I am another kind of anarchist." This is something he said to anarchists, Indian anarchists at a time, when he was trying to get people to support his movement against British colonialism. And I found I wasn't telling people that I'm a Gandhian anarchist, but I was pointing out that there are many kinds of anarchisms. Anarchism is, to me, the affirmation of the individual standing against society, the lone individual, if you like. But it's also based on another idea just as important as a model for society of how sovereign individuals can work together and live together in a form of mutualism, cooperation, agape, love, solidarity, friendship, care. And so in my view, it's a movement that I can honor, admire, that I think I certainly admired many of the old anarchists I met, and some young anarchists too. Admired their character, admired their courage, admired their brilliance sometimes, their ability to suffer for what they believed. But I see it as a current having affinity with many, many other similar currents or related currents, including, like things like engaged Buddhism and liberation theology, where people are it's just not about the labels. It's about the forms of association and the kinds of questions people are asking. The forms of association they're creating and the kinds of questions they're asking, and what their values are, and what kind of character they're developing. Responsibility to the greater whole, responsibility to the community, solidarity with the community, and solidarity with and responsibility to and care for the entire life web on planet Earth. Even things deserve our careful attention. Everything. Some of this comes from my Buddhism too. Everything kind of matters. Our mindfulness matters, and how we go about becoming mindful, how we go about becoming better human beings who actually can serve the whole, varies, and it changes and it evolves according to the necessities we face. I've been interested in the what used to be called the subjective factor revolution and in evolution, if you like. I think we can fetishize revolution too, so I'm careful about the term. For example, in my family, extended family, we've seen the ravages of the mental health problems and addiction, like many families. And I found that I had even things to learn from, like, the 12 steps and from mutual aid groups like Al-Anon, and talking to old AA people, which are non-hierarchical. They're confidential, anonymous, no leaders, and voluntary, and they're based on a mutual aid ethos. I learned a lot from them about asking about how to live, in my case, not in theirs, how to live and let live, but also how to live in some way against society, the society that we live in. There's much to live against, obviously. We're destroying the planet. We're destroying the life webs of the planet, and we're doing it out of stupid reasons. Nobody needs the stuff that's happening, and yet it's happening, and people are continuing to engage in these self-destructive and totally destructive things. To live against society, and also to live as we end up having to do, to live in the society and with the society. Colin Ward was, I guess, a famous British anarchist who writes somewhere about how, in a sense, in kind of a dialectical sense, anarchy exists and is going on every day. Again, this is we think of some of the insights of ecofeminism move in this direction too, talking about who is actually getting food for people, who's picking up the pieces after some people have made a big mess. They've done a lot of damage to society. In ecofeminist terms, it's more than often been men that have done the damage, and then women, mothers and grandmothers, picking up the pieces and getting food, cooking that if they can find it, and comforting children, and starting another garden, and all of the kinds of things that have to go on for any society, free society, unfree society, whatever. People have to eat, people have to get through their day. And there's a lot to learn from a paradigm like that. Capitalism would collapse if people didn't do more than they're expected to do to make things better for other people going about their daily life. I mean, the person in the box store where you're trying to buy a faucet to put in your bathroom or something, it's like 10 to 10, they're going to close. But he stays or she stays, they stay, and they take you to the aisle. They show you, you've got a flood at home, right? They take you, they show you, they take the time to do it. Now, you could say, why are they doing that, right? They should just be blowing up the place. And I know that feeling. But what they're doing is they're helping you. And so that is going on all the time, and people are doing it in the midst of a daily life in which they have to surrender, all of us, to some kind of humiliation. They're selling their labor for money. They're not getting enough money. They're getting exploited. And yet they're doing this for another person. And that kind of, not only would capitalism collapse if people stopped doing that, civilization would collapse. But not only would civilization collapse if people stopped doing that every day, society would collapse. It would be, we'd be walking down Cormac McCarthy's road, that's what we would face. And the reality, so it's very complex about how to work against this society and to work for the humane, sustainable, enduring forms that we have created and which work both for us and against us. And so, for example, I guess that leads to my as I've become an old man, I've become really a pragmatic, kind of a reformist or something. I mean, that people tell people, well, some days I'm a social democrat. You know, I was reading an article many years ago in the Catholic Worker. I had friends, and I still have friends who are in that. It's, you know, it's an anarchistic Christian, you know, kind of a affinity group or base community, if you like. You know, people know about it. I shouldn't have to go into it too much. Some people don't believe you can be an anarchist and a Christian. Well, I know people who are, so I don't know what to tell the people who believe so strongly in the labels. They live in very intentional ways. These Catholic workers. It's not my style. I don't believe in God. I find them. I find their culture intriguing in many ways and admirable. It's based on some great and also crazy literature and Jungian archetypes that exist all over the place anyway. So it's complicated. I've stopped arguing about religion, about whether God exists or doesn't exist, because it doesn't really matter to me. I don't believe in God, but I don't have all the answers to the universe. I mean, scientists now think the universe is a hologram. So what am I supposed to believe in terms of ontology or anything like that? So what are they doing with their lives? So one time I was reading this essay in the Catholic Worker by someone who was saying, you know, we are anarchists. He was writing, I mean, the headline had anarchism in it. I was curious. So he's an anarchist and a Christian. And he says, because we're anarchists, it doesn't mean that we can dispense with our sort of ethical obligation. He might have said a moral obligation to the community, a larger community. For example, we can say that capitalism is horrible, health under capitalism is horrible. We should have a completely different society. We should take care of everybody. But on the other hand, if they're getting rid of Medicaid for people, what do? We say, well, fuck Medicaid, because Medicaid is a gift from the state. We get it. People get it because everything's been stolen, primarily from the sacrifice zones in other countries. So, you know, let it all blow up. Derudi famously said, we're not afraid of ruins. Well, maybe we're more afraid of ruins now than we were in the 30s. He hadn't seen, and he wouldn't see, the Second World War, for example. Ruins can get pretty bad, and they're getting bad, and they're getting badder and worser every day. So we have this obligation and to reduce harm, among many other things. And so we fight to keep Medicaid and to expand Medicaid if that's all we have to do. And that's how I've spent the last, 20 years, really. I've been trying to reduce harm. As I've gotten older, I've become part, in a sense, of that group. I'm one of the least helpful members of it, of old people and women and older siblings and other people who help out when shit blows up and we're living in a ruin. But I try, you know, it's the old people carrying the little kids often, or the older sibling or the mother looking for food and so on, trying to keep society together and when it's coming apart. So my belief is not to have grand schemes, to carry some values and talk about values, and but also to make hard choices to protect what few things you can on this day in this place. So the last few years, I've been doing things like since since the last few years, I even tried to keep Trump from getting elected. And I did it the only way I knew how to do it, was to try to get the other people elected until we could work something out. I wasn't voting for them. I was voting against what I saw coming, which is now coming even more dramatically than I might have thought, even though I was warning about it very explicitly and with some imagination about how bad it was going to be in 2015. And then, hoping only to gain time, treating the Democrats, for example, as furniture you shove in front of the door until you figure something out better. Because the problem is society hasn't figured out much that's better. Or Trump would have lost by 80%. It wouldn't even be an issue. People would say, get rid of that asshole and let's deal with these people now. But people have, I know in a series like this that makes me probably outside the realm of the norm among people being interviewed. Although we happen to believe in Detroit that about half of anarchists do vote in this country. And I've met anarchists in Europe too, who went ahead and voted when they thought, do I really want these annoying fascists running things right now? Let's put it off for a little while. So that has been, I have tried to reduce harm. And I learned some of that, not from a book, although a lot of books help me evaluate these ideas. Books about ecofeminism, for example, books about other Sarvodaya movements, John Clark's books. Some of John Clark's writing has been great for some of that too. But I learned a lot of it from, for example, having to work with people who didn't agree with me politically, but who were good people, like teachers who were really good teachers who cared about kids, who went out of the way for kids. And knowing other people, I had to live with and to work with. When I went canvassing in the last election, I said I because I speak Spanish, I wanted to go to the Spanish-speaking community and talk to people there. I talked to people who were citizens, not citizens. I talked to people who didn't speak English. I was able to send people who didn't speak English to a program I work with, have supported, which teaches English to immigrants, all of whom, by the way, in this program, of course, are terrified now and are having to stay away and do things on Zoom. I was in the headquarters down on the southwest side of Detroit in the barrio, and there were people from the Service Employees International Union, and they were talking about. I didn't see the enemies that are often that this very complicated big party is. Made up of really horrible people, and of course, largely in the leadership, and then all kinds of other people who are trying to do some good work. I saw these union members who were canvassing, who were defending working women and defending caregivers and care workers. And to me, that was that meant something to see in the people actually who were going to be affected. Lately, over the last decade or so or more, really, I've come to think about freedom in a couple of different ways that maybe I hadn't thought of before. One is that it's a spectrum. There's a range of kinds of freedom, or maybe it's a constellation. There's a constellation of kinds of freedom and forms of freedom, and that are worth defending and worth expanding and opening and interrogating. And to me, that is what I have tried to do. And I think that has been consonant with my affirmation of my admiration for the anarchist movement. It's certainly not much like the classical anarchist movement, the ideological anarchist movement, but I find it interesting along similar lines. Recently in the last few years, this book by David Graeber and Wengrow, I think David Wengrow too, The Dawn of Everything, which is an enormous book. I haven't read the whole book, but I read some of it, and I thought it was ironic that to me it feels like the end of everything, and somebody publishes a book called The Dawn of Everything. I guess they knew they were doing that, obviously. But what they did was they kind of exploded one of the narratives that made me, in my own small way, a little bit famous as a writer. And that was this palingenic version, or this idea of the collapse of civilization and the rise of a new civilization. Also, this notion of like a kind of a fall. They argued against the idea that there was this freedom society. Some would say even before people started speaking, but before the state, at least. And then there was this event that occurred, this traumatic event, and the state emerged. The dikes didn't work and the water flowed out, or some kind of the men took power back from the women. There are all these stories. When Graeber and Wengrow said, actually, history is so diverse. There are all these possible human formations that show that it's possible to live in some ways we haven't even imagined. And we better start thinking like that, and not this sort of linear idea of paradise, fall of paradise, state, civilization, collapse of civilization, hooray, anarchy. And their archaeology and anthropology, there's a lot to question in them. There was an interesting argument with Kwame Appiah, what's his name, from Harvard, who had, in the New York Review of Books, you can look it up, arguments between Wengrow and Kwame Anthony Appiah, this professor who's a good guy, very smart guy, had a lot of questions about their archaeology and so on. And I figured it was going to take me, if it took him 10 years to write the book, it would take me 15 years to read all the stuff so that I could figure out who was right about this. But I was also felt unburdened because this was kind of my narrative. Look at my essay, Civilization in Bulk, which is online. David Watson's Civilization is in Bulk. You'll get it. And it's a famous essay about thinking in Mumfordian terms a little bit about how the state emerged, how the mega machine emerged. Really, it's a constellation, and there are many possibilities. And we need to take the possibilities that we can get to if they reduce harm, if they make people happy, if they protect people, if they protect all species, if they protect the life web as a whole, because we are just a part of the life web. We are one species, a very arrogant species, and we've done a lot of damage, and we have to acknowledge it. But we can do things, and that's how we live our life. I know in some of the cases people have been asked, do they have any hope? And I don't believe in hope too much. I like Václav Havel's reaction to that question. And he was no anarchist by any means. He said something along the lines of, hope is not the belief that things are going to be better or come out okay. It's having the faith to do what is the right thing to do. And that's what how we have to live.